the newsagents.
We're talking about borders today because there is a story that has probably passed you by, that is rumbling along quietly, that is about to become explosive. And at the heart of this story is the question of whether the EU can hold on to its free movement policy, a policy that lies right at the heart of everything the EU stands for, because individual states are starting to peel away and take their own actions right now.
And we're not just talking about small EU member states, we're talking about Germany, we're talking about Poland, countries at the heart of the EU which are saying we can no longer afford to have no checks on our frontiers. The question is that if this spreads, is it a bomb under the heart of the EU project? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And whilst we are here talking about borders, we should spare a thought for our poor colleague, John Sopel.
A man who has crossed a few borders in his time.
Yes, who was nowhere near either an EU border or a Russian border tonight.
He's on an island group, an unnamed island group.
A West Indian island group.
He's been working very hard.
Very, very hard. And there will be umbrellas in the cocktails as we speak. But we are going to return to this central question about the EU project and about whether individual states are allowed to act unilaterally if they feel they are under threat. Because over the weekend, Poland has decided to suspend asylum claims. It believes that Russia and Belarus are pushing migrants towards the Polish border, Syrians, people from the Middle East, people from North Africa, to try and destabilise their countries and then the wider EU. So they have made a unilateral action to say, no, we're not going to have the asylum rules applying anymore.
And these, of course, are EU asylum rules. And the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has issued this demand on the eve, or a few days before, a tense Brussels summit on migration this week. He is saying that the Polish state must regain 100% of the control over who enters and leaves Poland. Now, this is a statement which, on one level, you might think, well, that's not very controversial. But it is controversial within the bounds of the EU project because, of course, as part of the EU, as we discovered during the Brexit process, member states cede that control to Brussels and to a common policy. And this has been described as a hand grenade this weekend, right into the heart of Brussels. It's setting Brussels, the bureaucracy of the EU and Poland on a potential collision course. But the point is that it doesn't come in isolation.
Yeah. Because
only a month ago, Germany itself reimposed controls on several of its frontiers to deal with the problem of irregular migration after the centre-left government had been put under huge pressure by its political opponents and by rising discontent from the German public about unhappiness about irregular migration and the number of people coming into Germany. And we see this pattern being repeated in member state after member state after member state.
Yeah, it's very curious because Donald Tusk a month ago hit out at Germany and accused Germany of acting unilaterally and unfairly, and it called those unacceptable plans to introduce what they've called temporary controls in what should be a passport-free zone.
That's the Schengen Area
That's the Schengen Area.
Yeah.
When we talk about Schengen, we mean the borders that you can pass through in Europe in the EU without showing your passport. Now, it's worth putting what happened in Germany in a bit of context, because Germany in the last month or so has seen a few horrific stabbing attacks of the kind, I guess, that you would liken to our Southport attacks. But in Germany, unlike here, they did trace migrants back to those stabbings. One killed 3 people a month ago. And as a result of that stabbing, as a result of finding that it was a migrant assassin at the heart of that, the CDU, which is, if you like, the German Tory party, basically said, OK, we need to have more border control. The German government is a coalition, which is more on the left, which is now responding to this pressure and saying, oh, blimey, we don't want the CDU getting in. And we had those elections over the last few months where they were just state elections, but we started seeing far right, the Nazi parties, gaining seats. So now you've got this place where the German government is saying, I think we've got to do the same. And a month ago, they did start to put in very specific, very targeted controls on some of their borders. We shouldn't forget Germany has nine borders.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not everywhere. It's on the places that Germany thinks it is most vulnerable from hundreds of thousands of Syrian migrants that are being pushed through from Poland, and those ones, the Poles believe, are being pushed through from Belarus and from Russia by Putin to try and destabilise the whole pattern of immigration and security within the EU.
And of course, on one level, you might be thinking, well, why is this controversial? I mean, states should be able to control the borders in that way. But I think there's two things you have to understand about it. One is, as we saw in the Brexit process, freedom of movement, and Schengen in particular, is a shibboleth of the EU.
I was going to say, it's not a word you hear often,
no,
and then you say it
right.
twice.
Yeah. As a pillar, let's put it that way, one of the pillars of the European project. It is held up, and it's one of the reasons David Cameron, David Cameron, he might be looking on at this with some sense of irony, because of course during the Brexit negotiations, or the initial renegotiation I should say, before the Brexit process happened, when he was trying to get a quote better deal from the EU, he was basically asking for measures not unlike this, basically what he was calling then an emergency brake on overall migration for the EU if a particular state was under some pressure. Who knows, maybe if he'd got it, the whole history of the Brexit process might have been different.
Are just incredible, aren't they? But if this was the conversation that was happening when Cameron went off to try and seek a bit more of a compromise from Merkel, 8 years ago, would it have been? Would they have come back and said, "We hear you"?
Yeah, but it shows just how far the politics has moved since then. Because back then in 2015, you might remember, of course, Germany. There was in the EU migrant crisis of that year, where Germany accepted over 1 million people, largely from the Middle East, though not exclusively as a result of the Syrian civil war. Angela Merkel famously saying, "Wir schaffen das," we can do this, and the German public coming together to accommodate all of these people. German politics has moved, 1,000 miles. From that period, the tolerance of the German public.
That's interesting thing. I remember covering that story from Hungary, when Hungary basically shut its borders and said, we're not going to take any more migrants in.
Yes.
It did act unilaterally because migrants were arriving at the Hungarian border and trying to get onto Austria and Germany from Hungary. And Orban said no. When I first read the story about Poland, I had gone back in time and thought, oh yes, of course, Poland was always on that side, was always on the sort of, anti-migrant side that Hungary was. But it isn't now, because Poland's had this change of government. Donald Tusk was Mr. EU, right?
Yes.
So he is somebody who's now trying to be a national leader of his own country, having been such a prominent part of the EU project, who is now saying, blimey, we cannot do this without a pause. And we should emphasise it's not that they're shutting things forever, but they're shutting things temporarily. But it's still starting to spook the EU overall.
Yeah, and today as well, you've seen Torstein Frey, who is one of the leaders of the CDU in Germany, the party very likely to be the next German government, saying that he believes that the right to asylum in the EU is far too broadly defined, needs to be stripped back, and saying that there needs to be fundamental reform to the way Schengen operates. He says to save Schengen. He says we've got to reform it in order to save it. But that just shows the direction of travel and how far things have moved. And the reason this puts pressure on the EU, and the reason why it could be a bit of a bomb under the EU project, one of the reasons is because as soon as states start to act unilaterally, it has and the thing that Brussels most fears is that it has a sort of chain reaction effect. So you could see in terms of the pressure it puts on European solidarity. When Germany said that they were going to close some of their borders a month or so ago, you saw furious reaction from the Austrians and furious reaction, you say, from the Poles and other border states saying, well, if you try and turn these people away, we're not taking them, and we'll just keep moving them back. And so this is the problem, is that the EU relies fundamentally on a sense of solidarity between its member states, however strained it might be. And there is no doubt whatsoever that solidarity on this particular question is coming under the most fundamental strain as a result of the wider migration crisis. And it is something that is worrying Brussels.
Well, we're going to speak now to the ambassador of Estonia. And Estonia, as you know, finds itself right at the cutting edge of this question. It has a border with Russia and it has an EU border. And it is trying to manage that same problem itself. Ambassador Luby, thank you so much for joining us. Ambassador, just explain to us what is the fear at the border at the moment. I know from Poland's position, they fear that they are facing a huge rush of immigrants being pushed towards them from Russia and Belarus. Is that the same problem that Estonia is facing?
I think we have the same, same worries as Poland and many other countries in the Eastern Front are facing. We see that after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, they have nothing to lose. They want to really now push the full agenda they have. So right now, the war is happening, the hot war is happening in Ukraine, so that what's happening on the Polish-Belarusian border is very important to us, just as a reminder that this kind of hybrid warfare with migrants, so to speak, happened also just before the full-scale invasion of February 2022.
So just to clarify, you think Putin is using migration and migrants to fight this war?
Yes, the thing is that Russians have used all different, let's say, elements. They just, they are extremely opportunistic in their approach. They just see what kind of vulnerabilities there might that Russia is definitely using all the options at hand that they can, destabilize our countries, our democracies, how we function.
Ambassador, what do you make of the Polish government's proposals outlined this weekend, suggesting that the way that they want to deal with it, and this echoes to some extent what Germany has said as well, is to not apply European asylum law to these people? Do you think that's a good idea?
The thing is, we still lack details of that proposal. One thing, of course, is important that Prime Minister Tusk made the announcement at the party conference. As you know, all the party conferences are mostly for internal use. So that we're still expecting to see what are the details. We don't rush to say anything on that. We understand that the situation is serious. There is an increasing pressure on the Belarusian Polish border. Then whatever we can to help the Polish friends, we do that. Like again in the autumn 2021, Estonia also sent its border guards and police servicemen to help to keep the pressure back.
But of course, Germany. We have got details on what they've proposed, indeed what they've done, which is the reintroduction of some controls, internal controls, on a couple of their frontiers. And indeed we've seen the leadership of the CDU just today, basically likely to form the next government, saying that there needs to be a reworking of Schengen. Do you think that would be a good idea?
This very, let's say, unfortunate and delicate trend that's happening in the EU, that many of our internal liberties that we are used to for the past 30 years are now slowly closing down. But one thing, I don't say that everything that is happening and all the pressure on our external borders is happening because of what Russians are doing. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't underestimate that what Russians are doing is that at least they exploit those weaknesses and those trends to exaggerate. And they see that migration right now is a hot topic politically in Europe, and that's why it's more than probable that they use every means possible as a weapon as well. And one thing that is really a big worry or something that we need to get our act together. The issue is that we always do it individually. We don't do anything collectively. Russia just exploits all the individual weaknesses we have.
So what would be your message to the EU today? What do you need to hear that would bring people together on this?
I think what we need to hear is that we need to listen to each other. We need to understand what are the patterns. And if we do and react or act individually, then at least we should do it in the same information sphere that everyone understands. Because otherwise we don't never ever really get the full picture, and we can never really be an opponent to our adversaries. Because right now it seems that we only most react, so that our adversaries will have an upper hand because they have the initiative. So that's why, as I said again, I don't say that everything that's happening in Europe regarding immigration right now is mostly because what Russia is doing. But I'm just saying that what Russia is doing is definitely exploiting this situation, that politically it's very sensitive, and they know if they want to really increase, let's say, this kind of unsatisfaction amongst our citizens, then this is the card they definitely need to play.
When you look at the individual actions of Germany and then Poland, are you concerned that free movement around the EU is coming under threat? Do you think
No.
that the project needs to be reconsidered now?
Said it needs to be that we speak openly what the concerns are, that we share information. We do whatever we can to keep EU borders secure, so that we need to understand what's happening in the eastern border of Poland and Belarus. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to close down all the borders and re-establish internal borders. Exactly the opposite. So we need to do everything we can to dismiss those trends. Otherwise, as I said, we're going to the wrong direction, and it seems to me that we are feeding the adversaries' narratives.
But just on one other related but separate thing, I mean, we've got our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, I'm sure you'll know, meeting with the EU Foreign Ministers Council today. And there's more and more talk about this reset between the UK and EU. I mean, do you think that actually amounts to anything on the British side? Or is it just warm words?
No, I think it's extremely important, extremely good development. You know, the trends in the world, not only in our eastern border, but globally, are so important, so that UK and EU need to work together with all our allies, so that what's in the agenda in Luxembourg right now is not the EU-UK relationship. It's a global agenda. The war in Ukraine, the war in Middle East. I just hope that we don't let this EU-UK relationship pass due to great new, tensions between the two parties. So that I think this kind of a quiet, slow, pragmatic approach is very, very sensible, and we need to work on it so that both sides, more or less, it should be. We put on the table what are the practical needs both sides have, and just start to negotiate.
I thought you could hear with the ambassador. I thought it was a really fascinating conversation because it exactly brings out those themes we were talking about. It is the tension between the European centre and the periphery. And the fact that ultimately, the other reason this could be a big problem for Europe is that many of its populations, particularly in Western Europe, though not exclusively, consider that the EU has failed. It has failed to implement order at its borders. Now, that can be unfair for lots of ways, and we see lots of countries or lots of entities like our own or the United States struggling with exactly those questions. But the Frontex program, which is the EU border program, is widely considered to have failed. And generally, lots of parts or important parts of European electorates believe that free movement, or unabated free movement, let's put it that way, within the EU, Schengen, has made that worse. And so what you're seeing is, with a perceived failure of the centre and the centre not being seen to be able to do much about it, national governments reasserting their own sovereignty and reasserting in the face of electoral pressure their own policies to deal with that problem. But within an organisation like the EU, where the fundamental tension is always between power for the nation states and power for the centre, you can understand why that is such a potentially tense and difficult problem for the EU to sort out. I
agree, but I think you should also say that when you look at this, spat behind the scenes, and we know that Poland's foreign minister is in Berlin today, actually, this is top of the agenda now. You should also be really aware that this is exactly where Russia wants the EU. It's exactly what Putin wants. Yeah. It's as the ambassador was saying, they are highly aware that if they can create these internal divisions and start putting this question of, is the project cracking, in comes Putin. And, today it's Ukraine. Many of these countries are on the front line of wherever Putin could choose to go next.
And there was one person, well, a couple of people, but one person in particular in British politics, just to bring it back to British politics for a moment, who will
enjoy
quite pleased by what he's seeing, which is Robert Jenrick. Because what you're seeing from the CDU in Germany and others as well is suggesting, if there's going to be a fundamental reform of EU asylum law, well, there is an opening there for Robert Jenrick, in fairness, for him to say, well, that will be a moment for us to actually reassess the ECHR. Maybe we don't have to leave it, because we can reform it.
And he's been trying to make ECHR the new Brexit.
Indeed.
And this is basically an opening where, if people don't agree with him, they at least will have to consider what he is actually saying.
And you could make an argument to say, well, maybe there'll be a much harder right government, not a hard right government, but a centre-right government for sure in Germany. But, by the end of the decade, maybe a Le Pen government in France, all amenable to fundamental change within the EU, which someone like Jenrick can say we can take advantage of.
We'll be back after the break, and we're talking about obituaries and Alex Salmond.
Flags were lowered and tributes laid outside Holyrood this morning.
He was a brilliant political strategist.
Fearsome and fearless, this was a politician who was a powerful communicator.
Arguably Scotland's most significant First Minister.
I regarded him as the most accomplished and significant Scottish politician of modern times.
Alex Salmond made a huge contribution to public life and political debate in Scotland.
He was a big man in a small parliament. Alex Salmond said he made the unthinkable thinkable.
With him gone, Scottish nationalism has lost its most formidable voice and is already in decline. That is a measure of the importance of the man.
The SNP will struggle to find another leader with the charisma to bring them quite so close.
That was some of the reaction to Alex Salmond's death. Big political story of the weekend. Died at the age of 69, very suddenly. And clearly there's been much written about him, about his historic role and so on, which is all true, and it is all there. Titanic figure of Scottish nationalism, there is no doubt. We were talking this morning about kind of the tone, in a way, of some of the coverage of that death, because some of it was very gushing, and in some ways that's maybe not a surprise because he had a lot of fans and a lot of political allies. But certainly I felt a little bit with some of the coverage that there was a little bit of glossing over, in a way, the nadir of his career, which was the trial that he had where he was accused of sexual assault and rape. He was, of course, acquitted of all of those charges, but nonetheless, he himself accepted as part of that trial that as First Minister, for whom we would expect the highest of standards, he did not always behave properly or indeed wisely.
I think it goes to the heart of what we expect an obituary to be, and I think that has changed with the times, because I think formerly it was a eulogy. It was meant to be a moment of praise for the dead, and now it's meant to be a reflection on the weighing up of a life, both good and bad. And I guess one of the questions you're asking is, if he was tried and found non-guilty for criminality, but also recognised what he did was inappropriate or wrong, where does that sit in the obit? And Nicola Sturgeon, I think, was, very acutely aware of that when she made her comments on Saturday night and Sunday. She said, I won't pretend that we didn't have a falling out. I won't pretend there weren't difficult things between us, but he was my mentor. And I thought, actually, that was pretty elegant. I guess the question you're asking today is, some people won't be asked for their feelings. Some of his victims won't be asked for their feelings. Does that come at the top of what you're writing? Is it a footnote? Is it threaded throughout the whole thing?
Well, we're joined now by the General Secretary of the FDA Union, which represents a lot of civil servants, Dave Penman, who had a very different kind of take on all of this yesterday. Dave, you tweeted about the coverage and what people were saying about Alex Salmond's death and about the man himself. Just take us through what you were saying on Twitter yesterday and your views of it generally.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was difficult on Saturday because I, as everyone, shocked by the death of Alex Salmond, and every death is a tragedy for a family, and you're dealing with people who are dealing with a loved one. But I was also a bit surprised that a number of commentators and journalists and politicians were talking about not only his political legacy but his character, and they completely failed to mention the serious questions that were raised by the investigation that was done by Scottish Government and the trial that he faced around his character and the way he treated women in particular. And it was just being kind of skimmed over. So I thought long and hard about whether I said anything, but as a union that represents people who deal with ministers and have to deal with the consequences of when that conduct is inappropriate, I felt we had to say something, which I tried to balance around both the issues of his political legacy, which was fine for other people to talk about, but make the point that actually I think if you're going to consider someone's legacy and you're going to laud their achievements, you also have to recognise the flaws and deal with those issues if you're talking about them once they pass away.
I suppose it's difficult in one sense, though, isn't it, Dave? And I certainly found this doing my LBC show about it on Sunday, which is that it is important, and I agree with you, perhaps it wasn't nodded to enough to mention some of those failings, but he was acquitted at his trial. So it does make it difficult in terms of calibrating the response, right? But you're talking about a wider cultural problem which existed.
Yeah, but also what came out of his trial. Although, you cannot argue with a jury's verdict, but the evidence that was put before that trial, his own admission about his conduct, the way his lawyer talked about him, what he admitted to in terms of how he treated women, invading their space, his infamous kind of sleepy cuddle, touching people's face, kissing them on the lips, plying young civil servants with alcohol, shouting and swearing at civil servants. These were things which he admitted to as part of his defence, because he was arguing, I may be a flawed character in terms of how I treat people, but that doesn't make it criminal. But if he's a First Minister, if he's the most powerful person in Scotland, those issues about his conduct, even if they are not criminal, raise significant questions about his fitness for office. And that is what I tried to deal with at the time about what it said about his fitness for office, and also try to deal with it in the wake of his death.
I guess, Dave, one of the things we're grappling with now in a sort of 24-hour media context is when these things become okay to bring up, aren't they? Do you believe that the day of the death or the day after the death is the day for reminding people of that? Or, I don't think I have an answer to that, but I guess this will be uncomfortable listening for a lot of people, I think, because half our listeners will say, damn right, you should put that centre stage. If there is stuff about the treatment of women, that has to be right at the top. And others will say, what on earth are you doing? Whatever you think of his behaviour, he was an extraordinary sort of statesman who did extraordinary things for good or for bad for Scotland, and kind of put it on the map in a very new way in terms of the independence question. Shouldn't that be the first thing? I mean, the obits I've read, in the Times and the FT, for example, have tried to find that balance. So it's interesting you didn't think it came through.
So I think my response, and the reason why I made comment, was while some of the main news outlets, when they were talking in terms of an obituary, were obviously mentioned the court case and those issues, quite a number of journalists and political commentators didn't, but also talked about his character. They weren't just talking about his political achievements.
Yeah.
They were talking about, what it was like to socialise with Alex Salmond, and talk about him in terms of his personality. And I thought long and hard about this because, as I say, it's a tragedy. He has a family, he has friends, lots of people who, close to him and in terms of politics in Scotland who looked up to Alex Salmond. But there is absolutely also no doubt that there were serious questions about his conduct, and to make no mention of it, all I was seeking to do was to try and put a little bit of balance in there, as others have sought to do as well. I think it's a judgment about whether you do that in the immediacy of the death, or whether you do it later on. But I just felt the way too many people were talking about him, too many men journalists, to be honest, if I'm perfectly frank, about what Salmond was as a person, and that they made absolutely no mention of this in the question about those issues in the conduct. I felt I had to say something.
So you raised very specifically the question of criminality versus behaviour, and you've said, he acknowledged that obviously he was found not guilty on all counts in court, but he acknowledged some of his behaviour had been inappropriate. I guess, the word that gets bandied around the whole time is this one of cancellation. Do you believe that somebody like that, who has admitted to that kind of behaviour, should be, whatever this means, cancelled? I mean, taken out of the position of having any kind of, respectable obit written? He definitely hasn't been cancelled. I guess my question is, do you believe he should have been?
No, I think I truly believe that. I think the investigation that should have taken place in relation to the complaints that civil servants had raised should have been concluded, because there's a huge difference between what is subject to criminal proceedings and what legitimately can be dealt with in an investigation in an employment context, and that includes for ministers. I mean, there's an interesting legacy in all of this. The legacy is that in Scotland now, it's the only bit of the UK where in government we have a fully independent process now for dealing with complaints against ministers, because of what happened both in terms of the internal investigation and the trial. The Scottish Government, following two inquiries, introduced a fully independent process.
Well, of course, Dave.
The sort of issues that were raised about Salmond and whether people felt they could challenge his behaviour wouldn't happen now.
Well, of course, Dave, he went to his grave claiming that the investigation into him was corrupt, and indeed alleging that civil servants, as well as their political masters within the Scottish government had sought to pervert the process against him.
So I don't see that as contrition, to be honest. I saw an acknowledgement as part of a defence strategy at his trial. I don't really think I saw much contrition about his conduct. And as you say, he has proceeded to try and create conspiracy. Those individuals have found themselves being chased by Alex Salmond supporters, some trying to name them publicly. Our protagonist has went to jail because of trying to name individuals involved in the trial, and there's litigation. He was continuing litigation against Scottish Government and individual civil servants. So it was continuing up to the point of his death. Indeed, now some are trying to take that mantle on. David Davis is talking about trying to continue that sort of action that essentially was suggesting that there was some great political conspiracy.
Just on one other matter, Dave. You'll have doubtless seen Robert Jenrick, the Conservative leadership candidate, of course. One of the things that he said over the weekend is that he believes that the chief executive of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, should be dismissed, that he would sack her. What do you make of that?
It's extraordinary. He said in that interview as well he doesn't believe in empty rhetoric, and then he's essentially suggesting you can fix the NHS by sacking the chief executive who can't defend herself publicly. I mean, it's kind of par for the course, to be honest, of what public servants have come to expect, particularly from the previous Conservative government. I mean, it's extraordinary that someone who seeks to lead one of the great political parties of this country would indulge in that sort of gratuitous attack against a committed public servant. We've shown it with the other candidate as well, with Kemi Badenoch, talking about civil servants who they're so bad they should be jailed, and they're just. They're establishing themselves and making clear that they're not really fit for office. If that's how they're going to conduct themselves, the idea that these are the people that should be running the country, and that's how they treat public servants, in the full knowledge that they cannot defend themselves, just demonstrates that they're not really fit for office. And we've had 5 years of that. I'm glad that with a change of government, that tone seems to have changed from ministers. I hope they maintain that. But it's so disappointing to see people who hope to be elected to high office treat committed public servants in that way.
Dave, really grateful for your time.
Dave, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I think what this goes to the heart of, right, actually, is basically the question is, how much emphasis as a society do we put on the experiences of, in this case, women, but anybody who might have found themselves in the unfortunate position of being in a situation like that, which again everyone agrees and accepts as part of the trial. Salmond did not always behave wisely. I suppose maybe in a way, but then you see that's a really interesting point, because no one always behaves wisely. I know you're using it as a euphemism, obviously, but if you went through anyone's life, but he was the first minister. I suppose what I'm saying is that, look, don't get me wrong. I would be the first to say, clearly, he was an historic figure, and that has to come first, because he was an historic figure, and that's what
your place in history is. That's
what he will be remembered for. I suppose what I was just slightly surprised about is that, given everything that has happened in the last, say, 5-10 years, Me Too and everything, I was just surprised that perhaps there wasn't a little bit more emphasis placed on it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's complex, because he was acquitted, but
I'm always reminded of that scene in Succession when Logan Roy's died and the Sibs are all gathered together reading the front pages of the obit, and they talk us through the euphemism. So it's, man of his time, broadly, racist, a man who was always comfortable with the younger generation, paedophile, and you find these sort of very odd forms of phrase for sort of not saying the thing that you're not really allowed to say on the first day of an obituary, that nevertheless tells the reader what they know.
Right, that is it from all of us for today. Emily's had to dash. No doubt a very urgent meeting with yet another ambassador to go to. John will be back at some point, but we will be joined tomorrow, excitingly, by the undertaker of Prime Ministers himself, the former chairman of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady. God, when I say it like that, it sounds so exciting, doesn't it? Anyway, see you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.